agus fáilte arash to the Crazy House Prices podcast with me, Ciarán Mulqueen, and today I am talking to Sinn Féin TD and housing spokesperson Eoin Ó Broin about Sinn Féin's new housing plan called A Home of Your Own. Just as a brief summary of their plan, basically they want to deliver 300,000 new homes, including 125,000 social and affordable. It focuses on public housing with an emphasis on mixed income communities with social, affordable rental and purchase options. It talks about the private sector role, encouraging construction of 175,000 private homes. It also talks about environmental sustainability, ending homelessness, rent controls, community involvement, so tenants in the management and development of their communities. It also addresses labour shortages, funding and the right to housing in the Irish Constitution. So it's a really, really in-depth plan. And for me, I'm a layman, so when I see these things and I look at these plans, I always find them really confusing. And obviously the question is always like, well, look, how is this actually going to work? So I always think it's a good idea to get people on who have written these things to try and talk to them. And this is not a political episode. It's not about the other aspects of policy or anything other than housing. So it's not about scandals. It's not about who would they go into government with or anything like that. I think there are people more qualified and there are far more political podcasts available for you to listen to if that's what you're looking for. So my chat with Eoin today is more just about really going in depth into the plan, explaining how things are going to work, where the money is coming from, how to tackle all the questions that you guys sent in and questions that I had myself. So I think it's a really good chat. Have a listen to it. It's I think it's about an hour. I'm just finished with it there. So I think it's about an hour long. So it is really, really in depth. And I think it would be really interesting to hear a debate maybe between him and say Darragh O'Brien or other spokespeople for housing, whether it's in government. I don't even know who the Fine Gael spokesperson on housing is, but if Fine Gael and Green Party and People for Profit and all these other parties, it would be good to get them all around a table and debate it. But I do know from my own experience, whenever politicians are put around a table on one of these shows, they all end up just shouting at each other and not a whole lot gets discussed properly. So this is a good opportunity for them to maybe just back up their plan and tell exactly how it's going to be done. Because I know when you read headline figures and when you hear government, like anyone not in Sinn Féin them talk about it, they're just going to give out. So this is more a chance to maybe get a bit more in depth without having to sit down and read a 150-page document or however long it is. So it's a good chat. I hope you enjoy it and let's get stuck in. I just want to pause the podcast for a moment to talk to you about a company called Beat the Bank. So the stress of organising mortgage protection just got a whole lot easier with beatthebank.ie. This amazing Irish company offers the guaranteed lowest price for mortgage protection in the country, and it's not just for first-time buyers. You can switch your own mortgage protection anytime and enjoy the benefits of their market-leading discounts. I, along with hundreds of my Instagram followers, have used Beat the Bank and the feedback has been amazing over the last 12 months. With their 100% end-to-end digital experience, quoting and applying for mortgage protection has never been easier. You can get a quote in seconds and apply in minutes without the hassle of unwanted sales calls or any paperwork. So visit beatthebank.ie today and protect your mortgage with ease and peace of mind. Beat the Bank saves you time and money on mortgage protection, whether you're a first-time buyer or looking to switch. They've also just launched income protection and life insurance on the site too. And if you have a house or are renting and are planning to buy, you need to consider protecting your income. So check out beatthebank.ie. Now, back to the podcast. Now, Deputy O'Brien, thank you so much for coming on the Crazy House Prices podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ciarán.
Just to get straight into some questions that I have and then listeners and followers of the Instagram have about Sinn Féin's housing plan, A Home of Your Own. So your plan proposes 300,000 new homes, including 125,000 social and affordable. Now, we know from the past and the current that politicians often set big targets, but what are the specific steps that Sinn Féin would take within the first year in government to ensure that these targets aren't just goals on paper?
So first of all, what I would say is traditionally actually politicians set low targets. That's part of the problem with the previous government housing plan. But also the targets they set aren't based on any objective evidence. One of the things that's distinctive about a home of your own is we haven't picked the figures. The government 2 years ago appointed an independent housing commission. That's a commission made up of housing delivery experts, people in the public and private sectors who deliver homes every day. They told us this is the number of homes that are not only needed, but if the right policy prescriptions are put in place, that can actually be delivered, moving up to about 70,000 new build homes by 2028, 2029. To deliver that scale of new homes, particularly given that we'd have to move to 40,000 next year, in excess of 50,000 the year after, and then from 60 to 70,000 in the 2 years after that. Our plan sets out a series of very, very radical reforms. First of all, on the public housing side, because exactly as you said, 125,000 of those will be social, affordable rental and affordable purchase. And therefore, what we've set out is first of all, devolving far greater power to local authority, getting the Customs House, the Department of Housing, out of the micromanagement and the delaying of the delivery of social affordable homes. But also radically reforming public procurement through the use of multi-annual framework agreements to make it much easier for local authorities and building contractors to get those homes up and running and delivered as quickly as possible. It'll probably shock people to know that currently it takes 18 to 24 months in a public housing project before brick is laid in the ground. That needs to be shortened to about 6 months. And then on the private sector side, we have a very comprehensive chapter, which I suppose to summarise briefly, is trying to make the case to change the way in which the state supports and activates private residential developers. And the focus is much more on the early stages of the development cycle. So dramatically increasing the resourcing to the planning system and the court to remove barriers and delay in getting planning permission, provide builders, particularly SME builder developers, with much more competitively priced finance through home building finance, assist them with site servicing through the expansion of a really great public sector initiative called Housing Infrastructure Services Company, HISCO. And also then providing very specific bespoke support programs for those developers that want to do higher density development in inner urban areas to bring down the cost of development, but also ensure a good portion of those homes are sold for people to buy for their permanent family home. So it really is not just about setting targets. In fact, that's the shortest part of our plan. It's about transforming the way in which both the public and the private sector design, approve, tender, procure, and then build out those homes. And a lot of the proposals are the result of very extensive engagement, both with public and private sector developers, people who deliver homes, to work out what's the best way to deliver far more really good quality low carbon homes, but without the incredible lengthy delays that are currently experienced both on the public and private sector side.
Yeah, but in terms of actual, like how that would look or how you would do that, like specifically labor shortage, like there is no one, there's no one there to build, and we're seeing that how long it's taken things to get built. Where the workers going to come from?
First of all, it's a mistake to say we've a labour shortage right now. We certainly don't have enough labour or allied professionals to deliver 70,000 homes. But actually, if you talk to industry professionals, and again, the Housing Commission is made up of many of those, their view is we can get into in excess of 40,000 right now with the 170,000 odd workers we have in construction. If we solve those other problems, and those problems around planning, procurement, credits and site servicing. And as we're doing that in years 1 and 2 of our plan, we would also be putting in place a workforce plan, both in terms of construction workers, allied professionals such as planners, which is one of the big backlogs in the system, as well as quantity surveyors and others, but also expanding the role of new building technologies, off-site manufactured high quality homes, which is a new type of employment, so that over your 5 years, as you're moving from the 40,000, which we could be delivering with the other reform, to 50, 60 and 70, you're building that labour force. We also need to ensure that the workers we have are building the right kinds of things. We do not need more data centres and apart hotels. We do not need more high-end, super expensive build to rent. And therefore, through changes in the tax code and the planning code, we can ensure that the construction workers that we do have are building what we most need. And what we most need right now is affordable homes, as well as other key infrastructure projects, such as public transport, renewable energy, as well as some other public work. So more can be done with what we have while we're building up that multi-annual workforce plan. But that needs to be set out and agreed by industry. And again, if you go back to the Housing Commission's report, they have some really important recommendations around building that labour capacity, which we have supported and endorsed in our own plan. Likewise, for example, I've been talking to the Irish Planning Institute and other professional bodies to look at what would be the best way to ensure year on year, not only are we increasing the number of planners and other allied construction worker professionals coming out of our own system, but we're also attracting people back home, as well as bringing in labour from abroad to fill those critical skills gaps. But don't let anybody tell you that we can't build more with the construction sector workforce that we have. We can, but only if things are managed more efficiently.
But like, do you have a target for how many additional workers will be needed to meet your goals?
So industry experts and policy experts reckon that we need at least 200,000 construction sector workers. So that would be an extra kind of 30,000 on what we have now. And you need to build that over a 3 to 4 year period. But also the new building technology sector is really important. Like, we can't deliver on average 60,000 new homes a year using traditional high carbon building technologies and construction sector methodologies and meet our emission reduction targets in 2030 and 2050. In fact, a significant volume of the new homes that we're proposing aren't going to be built by traditional construction sector tradespeople. They're going to be built or manufactured, should I say, off-site, often with very skilled jobs, properly unionised and well-paid jobs. And that's a different type of employment. So therefore, it's a mixture of, first of all, building the construction sector capacity, that traditional construction sector work capacity, to about 200,000 workers. On planning, for example, we're going to need another 500 to 600 individuals working in planning. We're going to need allied professional staff, obviously, in engineering and quantity surveying, but also we're going to need that off-site manufacturing labour to produce the new building technology homes. And one of the things we've set out in the plan is, within a very short period of time in taking office, sitting down with the very sectors, we have to publish a 5-year workforce plan to take us through each of those. And that would have to have explicit targets as to what you're hoping to recruit, what you're hoping to train, and how you're hoping to grow those sectors. But some of that also involves providing greater certainty. So, for example, I talk to builders all the time, and they tell me if they had pipelines of work, either with local authorities or with others, they could expand their own workforce. The problem is they have to tender for each job separately. And that's a very precarious way to grow your company. Likewise, when I talk to new building manufacturers, the folks doing off-site stuff, their problem is while they would be willing to employ more people, they don't have the pipeline. So again, changes to procurement, changes to the way in which we finance development will also assist helping those, particularly the SME sector, build its own capacity over time. So it's not all just about workforce planning. It's not just all about recruitment. It's also about ensuring we tackle those other blockages in the system that give either private contractors working for public sector developers or private sector developers the certainty that they have the pipeline of work to allow them to expand, and that will attract people into that employment over the short to medium term.
And would you be looking at setting up a state construction company or continuing on the way things are at the moment?
So under our plan, if you take those 125,000 public sector homes, social, affordable rental and affordable purchase, first of all, a lot of those will continue to be delivered through Part 5 or through forward purchasing agreements or design and build with private developers. So that's still going to be that portion of it. But what we also want to do, and that means that's all private sector construction, we also want to build the volume of public homes where the state is the developer, which is kind of public homes on public land. The bulk of those are going to be built by private build contractors. That's the way we've always built public housing in this country, and it will continue. But we would like to pilot two things. We would like to pilot some direct builds in a mid-sized local authority, a portion of their new build homes where they'd actually directly employ the labour. I'd be really interested in Minister to see not only what improvements does that give you in terms of productivity and efficiency, as well as ability to attract people into secure employment, but also how does it operate in terms of value for money. And then we have a particular problem in Dublin. The 4 Dublin local authorities are in the main now moving towards much higher density, more complex residential construction to meet the needs of people living in the city and county. Only a small number of primary contractors tender for those jobs, in some cases only 2, and I have a big concern over the prices they're charging. So in the plan, we set out that if the 4 Dublin local authorities were interested in establishing a commercial publicly owned building contractor, we'd work with them to do that. In part, to put manners on the private contractors who are tendering for the complex high density projects in Dublin. but also to ensure then when there's a commercial return to recycle back into the public sector. I have never been a fan of the idea of a single state construction company. Housing isn't statewide. Housing is regional and local. And therefore, whether you're using private building contractors through multi-annual framework agreements, or whether you're using direct build within local authorities or publicly owned commercial contractors, they're best done locally and regionally. And therefore, it's a mix. But the bulk of the building is going to continue to be done over the 5 years by private building contractors. But it's important to distinguish contractors from developers, and we want to significantly grow the role of the public sector as a developer, a doubling of social housing output and almost tenfold increase in affordable rental and affordable purchase output on the public sector side, while also obviously growing the private sector side, particularly in terms of the owner-occupation market, which has stagnated in recent years, deliver far more good quality new homes for people to buy, particularly first-time buyers.
Yeah, but realistically, private developers, like it or not, they play a huge role in the housing market. So what specific policies would Sinn Féin implement then to keep those developers incentivized, especially to build homes for purchase rather than for rental?
Absolutely. And look, 60% of all new homes under our plan will be built by private residential developers for the private market. A small portion of those will obviously be self-build, but the bulk of the remainder are for private, and particularly for private purchase. So a couple of things. Part of the problem with our residential development sector at the moment is it's kind of left to its own devices, carrying on an awful lot of risk and an awful lot of additional cost at the early stages of development. There's also all those obstacles that we mentioned earlier, and that can be the high cost of finance, that can be the challenges of tight servicing, particularly in inner-city brownfield sites where we need higher density developments, but also it can be the very significant delays in planning, particularly in on-board Finola and judicial review, because of chronic under-resourcing by this and previous governments. And then what the government does is having left the development sector to its own devices, who are producing a very, very expensive product, the state then steps in at the end with either very badly designed direct subsidies to developers, things like the Local Infrastructure Housing Activation Fund or Croí Cónaithe cities, or really inflationary demand-side subsidies for the purchasers, so-called Help to Buy, and a controversial high-risk shared equity first home scheme. So we want to shift that completely, and there's a whole chapter, it's the second largest chapter in the plan, which is about how the state needs to support the private residential development sector as early as possible. That means speeding up planning, that means providing low-cost finance, that means providing a much more commercially attractive mechanism to service the sites. We have a really, really innovative compact growth support program for folks who want to do higher density residential development in urban centres, with a set of kind of wraparound supports for those developers at the early stage. And by doing all of that, what you're doing is you're removing barriers, reducing risk, speeding up the development process prior to getting on site. That's all going to reduce the all-in development costs to developers. And then the expectation is that will be passed through to purchasers, particularly for owner occupation. None of that is money for free. That those kind of approaches by government, and they have a long list of acronyms of schemes, simply don't work. They don't produce increased development. Cónaithe cities have been a disaster. Lighthouse has been a disaster. Terribly wasteful in not producing units. Or they're super inflationary, like so-called Help to Buy, etc. What we want to do with all of those is either A, end them on day one and redirect that money into delivery of good quality affordable homes. But with Help to Buy, what we want to do is phase it out gently over 5 years as we're increasing the supply of affordable public homes to purchase a price of 250,000 or just above, but also supporting the private residential development sector to deliver more good quality homes at more moderated prices. What we would do with Help to Buy is increase the loan-to-value ratio to 85% in the first year, to ensure those people are still getting it, or those who really need it. And then from year 2 to year 5, we reduce the grant amount by €6,000 a year. That would mean really in the first 2 to 3 years, the majority of those people who currently need it would still get it, and get it at the rate they would currently get it. We'd also abolish stamp duty, which would take another 1% off the purchase price. But we have to send a signal to market that over a period of time, the objective here is for the price of new build homes to come down. We're now back into double-digit home price inflation. The rate of inflation for new build homes is still very, very high, particularly outside Dublin. And then the other big thing that we want to do, if you look at our residential development sector at the moment, you've got the two big players, the PLC, and they're fine. they're working away. But the SME sector is still really struggling. And that's important for outside of Dublin and the commuter belt. So in fact, virtually nothing is getting built by the SME sector there at the moment. And a lot of our very specific programs. So for example, while the government has ended the very badly designed development levy waiver and utility connection waiver, we want to reintroduce that, but targeted at the SME builder developer sector only when they're building homes for people to buy on the open markets, not for institutional investors, TRS, or the large PLC. That's a much more targeted measure, but also ensuring through the Home Building Finance Ireland, those SME builder developers can get really competitive finance. Right now, HBFI is actually lending to that sector at a higher rate than the banks, even though HBFI is getting that money much, much cheaper from the Strategic Investment Fund. So again, when I talk to that SME sector, what they're telling us is they need access to lower cost finance, they need planning to be much more streamlined. And then the other big issue for that sector is land, getting up a pipeline of land. And that's not just for the very small folks, that's absolutely the case for folks who are delivering up to about 500 units a year. So again, we have a whole other chapter in the plan around active land management. We want to transform the Land Development Agency into an agency solely focused on active land management. On the public sector side, ensuring there's an adequate pipeline of land for our public housing programme. But also, like in other European jurisdictions, we need an active land management agency to intervene in the private land market, offering acquiring sites, getting planning and site servicing, and then auctioning them off to residential developers, again, significantly reducing the all-in cost of development and in turn reducing the cost to the purchaser at the other end.
So in your plan, you're as you mentioned there's a huge public housing component, but like how would that work in, say, the city? So around me, everything is either being built for social or is for rent. There's nothing new being built that people can actually buy. So in that Dublin market, it's just heavily tilted towards rentals. So what would you do in what steps would you take in the short term, in the here and now, that would make it an option for people to actually buy a home in the cities?
So the first thing is our model of public housing is very different to what's there at the moment. We want to get away from this idea of a few social homes over here or a few affordable homes over there. We want to get back into the business of really good quality mixed income housing estates, including in those higher density inner urban areas, which aren't just social home housing for lower income folk, but genuinely affordable rental at prices at or below €1,000 for those people who want to rent long term and aren't eligible for social housing or looking to save for deposit. But genuinely affordable purchase for people who want to own their own homes. And that means being able to purchase a home in the urban core of Dublin, 80 or 90 square metre home for 250, 260, 270,000 euros. And we've set out with full costings how we would do that. So for your listeners out there who aren't eligible for social housing but want to rent affordably or want to buy affordably, they need to understand our alternative model of public housing includes them right up to households currently on single or joint incomes of 90,000 gross, and then for that to be reviewed annually. But also, and this is a really important question, I talk to a lot of residential developers who would love to build good quality apartment or apartment and duplex or three-storey walk-up development in the urban core of Dublin, of Waterford, of Cork, etc. But the risks are just too high. It's simply too expensive to speculatively buy a brownfield site or a commercial site and go through that long journey to get it into construction. And that's why the only people who are buying those developments are approved housing bodies for social housing or for purchasing institutional investors or rental. So one of the reasons why we've come up with this really innovative compact growth support program is to have a set of supports for those developers. So for example, let's say you're an apartment developer here and you do blocks of 50 to 100 units. You're going to be able to now avail of this support program whereby you've identified a piece of land, anywhere in the inner urban core of Dublin, inside the canals. And instead of you having to speculatively buy it, get zoning, get planning, go through complex, expensive site servicing, all of that will be provided through a one-stop shop through the local authority. The local authority will sit down with the developer before they've even bought the land and enter into a non-binding, in-principle agreement for the best use of the land. While that developer then is going off sorting out site servicing and low-cost finance through HIPP and HITSCO, the local authority will be master planning it, therefore completely de-risking the developer for planning. That will go through public consultation. There'll need to be then a formal planning application. But all of that will happen in parallel with the ongoing work of development. That will allow you to get on site much, much more quickly as a residential developer and build out much more quickly. And then because you've got this set of supports, nothing for free, but everything being provided at an attractive, competitive commercial rate, through an open book exercise, in this instance, will ensure that the purchase price of those units will be passed on to the purchaser. And again, that in principle agreement at the start between the developer and the council will include the tenure mix. And that could be, for example, if an area that needs a higher percentage of purchase apartments for first-time buyers and others. This is an area that needs an equal mix of private rental, but at more moderate prices. What's the public mix in that? And when I talk to the developers who are in this space, I'd say, if that support program is there, what does that mean? They tell me they could get back into inner urban core residential development without being reliant either on forward purchase agreements from the housing body sector or indeed from the institutional investment sector. But also, even where there are forward purchase agreements for the institutional investment sector or AHB, because we're going to make changes to public housing policy and to planning, there's going to be a far greater mix for purchase as well as for rent and public housing in those developments. Because what works best is really good quality mixed income communities. And therefore, both through public housing policy, through support programs for residential developers, and through planning, we need to ensure, particularly in our inner urban cores, which are hollowing out at the moment for all the reasons that you know as well as I do, that housing policy, planning policy, and the funding of residential development, the public and private sector, is ensuring that good quality homes for mixed income communities are built in those inner urban cores to provide long-term sustainable residential development and sustainable communities.
But if your plan then broadens the eligibility then for social and for affordable or cost rental or whatever it is, sounds good in theory, but would that not just lead to much longer waiting lists than we already have?
Well, the first thing is, for example, in Dublin, we're not going to change the social housing eligibility. There are 3 bands for social housing eligibility. The third band affects about 10 rural counties. It makes no sense. But for those 10 counties, we'd move them to the second band, and that will have an impact on the number of people waiting for social housing. But that's fine because it'll capture real need. But we're also going to double the output of social housing, so that'll capture that. And on the affordable housing side, we're not currently proposing to change the cost rental eligibility, and we have our own eligibility for the affordable purchase currently at 90,000 gross, although to be reviewed annually. But we're going to have a tenfold increase in the output of affordable rental and affordable purchase, and that'll more than capture that need.
Well, just on the cost rental there, because my problem with the cost rental is it's not cost rental, it's market rent. Whereas if you're looking at the Vienna model, that was based on cost. So surely you would need to change that, because I mean, I don't even earn enough as a teacher. I'm teaching 10 years. I don't earn enough to qualify for cost rental of a 1-bed apartment.
So one of the huge problems with the way in which this government has designed so-called cost rental is, one, it's not cost rental. It's not based on the full cost recovery principle. It's discount for market rent, which is completely bizarre. And under Sinn Féin, that would be scrapped. It should never have been introduced in the first place. Ironically, it's not in the legislation. It's just a policy requirement government has added on after the passing of the Affordable Housing Act. But also, even if we're full cost recovery, it's not affordable. If you look at the rents, for example, that are now coming in right across the LDA and the approved housing bodies, increasingly a 1-bedroom is 1,400, a 2-bedroom is 1,100, a 3-bedroom is 1,800. No, Devonley Gardens, it's going to hit 1,900 for the first time. And in fact, the bulk of the cost rental that we're seeing isn't in the urban core of Dublin. It's in the periphery, where I'm in City West, for example. And in all of those cases, the so-called cost rents are higher than the existing rent for existing tenants as per the Residential Tenancy Board rental index. So that whole model has to change. And again, our proposal is much closer to the original principle of cost rental. It's not in any way linked to market rent. It's linked to full cost recovery, but also an affordability requirement. And therefore, if your rents are coming in at or below €1,000 for singles and for couples, depending on location and size of property, then you're able to catch that entire cohort of people above the eligibility for social housing. What we're finding at the moment is there's an ever-growing number of people who earn too much for social housing and not enough for cost rental, either a single or couple. The minister has just changed the law to change the income eligibility criteria for cost rental And the definition of household allows two single people to share a two-bedroom cost rental unit, but their income to be treated separately. Now, I'm not against that in principle, but the difficulty is it's not solving the real problem, which is making the one beds more affordable. And you run the risk of two entry-level nurses or two entry-level guards.
Hi, I am just going to pause the podcast for a second to talk to you about some sponsors of the Crazy House Prices podcast. This episode is sponsored by Daft.ie. Daft is Ireland's #1 property portal. Daft has the most properties available for sale and rent and is the preferred national property website amongst consumers in Ireland. So Daft.ie's core vision is to make buying, selling and renting property better for everyone in Ireland. So Daft's mission is to simplify each step of every property transaction in the Irish market to make buying, selling and renting in Ireland simple. That's why Daft.ie build innovative tools like Offers by Daft, an online real-time offers platform that provides never before seen transparency for the Irish consumer when buying a home. Are you looking to buy? Maximise your chances of finding your dream home by visiting Daft.ie, Ireland's #1 property website.
Sharing a place in their mid-20s. But when they get to the 30s and they want to set up their own household, get a partner or have kids, they could end up being trapped involuntarily sharing right into their 30s, something or other in the private rental sector. Yeah. So absolutely, our model of cost rental, it's true to what cost rental is meant to be, but also crucially, it has to be affordable. And again, we set out how we believe that can be done through longer term finance, through greater use of direct delivery, and greater embracing of new building technology. So it's not just about the total number of affordable homes to rent or buy. The way we would deliver those would mean on the rental side, genuine affordability, but also on the purchase price, on the purchase side, we would be delivering really good quality, affordable homes for people to purchase at prices that are about half what the government are charging if you want to have outright ownership of one of their so-called affordable homes.
So let's say your plan did work then and it did bring down house prices. How would you tackle that then for people who have bought a home now and are looking then at being in negative equity?
So first of all, our focus is to bring down the price of new homes. We can do that directly through the way in which we split the cost of construction from the land-related cost in our affordable purchase model. And that's how the homes can be bought at that price of 250, 60, 70. And on the private side, we're looking at moderating the price. It's not clear over the life of the 5 years, if we were in government, what impact that would have on overall house price in terms of the homes that people have bought. Ultimately, of course, that's a medium to long-term question because you need to see how that pans out. But for me, the first priority is ensuring the people who today cannot afford to buy homes are able to do that, both through affordable purchase to the state and more moderated private residential development. What I'd also say, though, is this idea that somehow our plan, if implemented, would plunge people into negative equity, I simply don't accept. I don't believe there's any evidence for it. And interestingly, it's a charge that has only been made by government, not by housing policy experts. I'm not interested so much in impacting the price of second-hand homes. That market will look after itself. At the moment, second-hand home inflation is far, far too high, but that's in part because the price of new homes is also too high and there's far too few new homes being delivered, and that's putting huge pressure on the second-hand market. But ultimately, if we want to address the affordability crisis, the price of new build homes has to come down. It cannot continue to increase by 7, 8, 9, 10, 11% annually. Nobody benefits from that. But I don't accept that the proposal that we've set out, both for direct affordable delivery by the state and more moderated private sector delivery by the private residential development sector, is going to plunge people into negative equity. It may or may not have short-term impacts on the price of their homes, depending on location. But in the medium to longer term, that stuff will all wash out. But crucially, if you own a home, you're in a decent position subject to being able to afford your mortgage. Housing policy needs to now on those people who cannot afford to buy or rent homes. And that needs to be the priority. And interestingly, if you look at the opinion poll evidence over a number of opinion polls, the vast majority of the public accept that because they understand house prices are at runaway levels. And that's what needs to be constrained.
Yeah, but I guess I'm thinking of those people that have bought in recent years and are looking to then, if they want to sell and move on to another home, whether it's getting a bigger home, the starter home idea, which is, it's not something I believe in anyway, this housing ladder, because it implies you have to keep climbing. But for those people who would have a concern about that, is it not going to mean then that they can't sell their house because it's worth less than what they own it, and they're kind of stuck then. They're stuck where they are and they wouldn't be able to move on.
The first question, of course, is what are your priorities in government? And right now, what we're saying to people is our priority is to ensure that those people who cannot access secure and affordable housing would be able to do so, both on the private residential side, on the public affordable housing side, on the social housing side. They are our priorities because they're the people who don't have any home. I genuinely don't believe that the delivery program that we've set out is going to create the kind of difficulty you're highlighting in any meaningful way. Obviously, we'd have to wait and see, but people need to be very clear. Our priorities for those people who do not own a home, either a social, affordable rental, affordable purchase, or private owner-occupier home. And in government, as we set out in our plan, what we want to do is ensure those people who right now don't have an affordable roof over their heads, get an opportunity to have that affordable roof. They have to be the priority because they're the people in the greatest need.
It's just that kind of social dilemma, though, isn't it? That oxymoron of everyone needs house prices to come down, but then people don't want their own house price to come down. So, in terms of supply side,
and I think let me just make this point, right? There was a time in the Celtic Tiger where everybody was obsessed by house price, right? And they asked the value of their asset. I'm out talking to people every day as a constituency politician, including people who own their own homes, people who are looking to buy, people who are renting and paying high rent, or people who are languishing on local authority waiting lists. What people talk to me about isn't the asset value, it's the affordability of it. I think public opinion on this has changed significantly, and I think that's backed up by a lot of opinion poll evidence. And even those opinion polls that are, do you accept that house prices have to come down to solve the housing crisis? A majority of people who own their own home answer that question in the positive because they have children or grandchildren or family and friends who are stuck, unable to buy or rent affordably. And therefore, the overwhelming majority of people, I think, accept house prices are too high. They have to stop rising. And government's job is to ensure new house prices are brought down. And therefore, I think that's an argument. If the government wants to have an argument with me during the course of the election campaign about whether new house prices should come down or continue to rise, that's an argument I'm happy to have. And I suspect the overwhelming majority of people will be on my side of the argument.
Yeah, and I personally would agree with you. I just know that there are a large cohort of people, and I probably would include myself in that if we outgrow this house, which, we've a very, very small house. But if we were to have another child, we'd need to move. So then if your plan did work and prices came down, I wouldn't be able to move. But maybe it's hard to tell whether that would actually be the case. But in terms of supply, because just want to move on to that, the Airbnb short-term rentals, would you look at banning those or restricting them?
Yeah, so for me, because we obviously were part of the reason why Eoin Murphy introduced the regulations in 2019. We've been raising this issue with Donald Coveney from 2016. The Oireachtas Housing Committee did a very good report setting out what the regulations should be. The problem here is enforcement. The regulations are fine from my point of view, but there's no meaningful way of enforcement. And we've said this over and over again to this minister and his predecessor. I tabled legislation 2 years ago that I believe would have fixed this problem, and it's very straightforward. Right now, in a rent pressure zone, if you have a property that got planning permission for long-term residential use, and you're short-term letting it, you need a change of use planning permission if you're doing it for more than 90 nights a year or a second home permanently. I would place, what my legislation did was place an obligation on the short-term letting platform to confirm with the host that they have the appropriate planning permission, change of use planning permission, or exemption. And if they didn't, the platform like Airbnb would be fined every day an administrative fine equal to and just above the money that they would make in that property being rented out.
Would that create a black market then, though, or another website, or people will find a way around it? So how would you actually enforce it?
But I'm absolutely of the view that whether it's the platforms, the estate agent, or anybody else advertising such a property, that you would be able to hit them with a spot fine. I do have to say the register idea that the government has belatedly come up with isn't a bad idea. In addition, it currently works for B&Bs and it should work for short-term lettings. So I think a combination of the spot fine, as I've outlined, where a platform and estate agent advertising the property that doesn't have the appropriate planning permission, alongside the register that requires short-term letters to register. We need that anyway because we need to regulate short-term letting outside those areas of high rental pressure demand and where there's a need for short-term letting for a tourism product, particularly in rural or scenic areas. They're the two solutions. The problem is, we're in the dying weeks of this government. They said they were going to take action on it, and they didn't. We know what the solutions are. It's the fine on the platforms and the estate agents for facilitating the breaking of the rules, and it's a register to require compliance, just like exists with B&Bs. Unfortunately, this government hasn't acted, and therefore those rental properties that should be in long-term rental or in owner occupation, because some people might decide they don't want to be long-term landlords if they're forced out of short-term letting, and they may put their properties on the market for people to buy, to live in as owner-occupiers, and that's fine too. What I would say, however, is clamping down on illegal Airbnbs is not the solution to the crisis in the private rental sector. The problem in our private rental sector is government policy for too long has pushed too many people into a sector that doesn't meet their needs. They don't want to be there, and it can't handle them in real terms. And therefore, dramatically increasing public housing, social affordable rental and affordable purchase, dramatically increasing owner occupation. Our plan would treble the number of new units coming on stream for people to buy each year. That would start to relieve pressure from the private rental sector, because a very significant portion of people who are currently living in it would now have tenure options that most more appropriately suit their needs. And over time, actually, what we'd see is the private rental sector shrink as a portion of the overall housing system. And those people who remain in it are those people who want to, or for whom it meets their needs on a short, medium, or long-term basis. So while the stuff around short-term letting is really important, it would be a mistake to think that's going to solve the pressures on the private rental sector. The solutions to the private rental sector are to be found outside private renting in public and private owner occupation.
I was just looking the other day at how it's gone in New York since they brought in the regulations on Airbnb, and it doesn't seem to have improved things at all. But then I know some cities like Barcelona and places like that have shown small improvements. So I guess that would...
The issue here is enforcement, and in both of those cases, the enforcement is weak. Barcelona better than New York, right? But enforcement has to mean what it says on the tin. Like right now, the overwhelming majority of short-term lets being advertised on Airbnb are illegal. They do not have either a change of use planning permission or they do not have an exemption. If Airbnb was fined for every single day each one of those properties were advertised, that would clean up its act. Clearly, then you have to find what may or may not go onto the black market. But that's the only way to do it, and that's currently not in place in any of the jurisdictions you mentioned. And that's why I'm convinced that's a key policy tool. But ultimately, far too many people who don't want to be in the private rental sector are being forced into it. What we need to do for those people is give them housing options outside the private rental sector that meet their need.
And then more on supply, your plan doesn't include a vacant home tax, and I think vacant homes are the easiest way to increase supply. And many kind of housing advocates say the vacant home tax is a powerful motivator. Can you explain why it's not included in your plan and what you'd propose instead if vacancy levels remain high?
Two things. It is in our plan. It's very clearly in the section on vacancy. And in fact, we probably have the toughest vacant homes tax that's there. So as you know, currently the government is applying a vacant home tax just on a small number of properties, and it's a multiple of the LPT. The way our vacant home tax is, it would apply at 1% in the first year to all vacant homes, but it would increase by 50% every year. That's a very dramatic increase in escalation in the financial cost of somebody sitting on a vacant. We would also transfer the derelict sites levy to revenue and make it a derelict sites and property tax. It would start at 7% in the first year, which is currently the case, but it would also increase by 50% each year. So the idea is you would be sending a really clear signal to anybody who is speculatively sitting on a vacant or a derelict home. The game is up. The cost of this to you over a short number of years would be so punitive that you'll either get it into direct use yourself, rent it out, or sell it to somebody who's going to use it. So they're two key measures in our plan. But we also need to make it much easier to bring vacant and derelicts back into use on the public and on the private sector side. And again, both in our public housing programme and also then in the vacancy and dereliction section of the plan, we set out a whole raft of measures. One, to make it much, much easier for local authorities to acquire vacant and derelicts and bring them back into social affordable purchase and affordable rental use. We'd also reform the vacant and derelict refurbishment grant, something you've done a lot of work on, to ensure that it's paid in stage payments rather than arrears, which is really holding up access to it at present. And also that long promised proposition of having a one-stop shop in our local authorities to get all your planning and certification for converting over the shop use, something that's very simple to do. Orla Hegarty and Deirdre Line actually published legislation some years ago and it could be quickly enacted, would also be key, because a lot of the vacancy in our urban centres is actually over the shop vacancy, and the grant in and of itself doesn't lend itself to addressing that. So we have the very, very heavy stick of punitive compound interest, vacant and derelict property taxes run by revenue. We also then have really, really strong measures in the public sector side and on the private sector side to make it much easier for people to bring those vacant and derelicts back into use. I estimate we have, about 80,000 vacant and derelicts that you could really go after, including commercials. Geo Directory reckons about 100,000 between the two. I think it's a little bit less than that, but there is simply no justification why we shouldn't be throwing the kitchen sink at those. The level of vacancy and dereliction being brought back into use by this government and the previous government annually is paltry. It's in the hundreds. It should be in the thousands annually. And that would also require setting targets for local authorities in the public housing programme, depending on the local authority area and level of vacancy and dereliction. So they have actual targets to bring units back into use as well.
So I couldn't see the tax there in your document. Sorry. So you're saying it's 1%, and then the next year it goes up to 1.5, and then the next year 2.25. Is that what you mean? It's going up 50% each year?
It's by 50% every year on the vacant properties, from 1% in year one. And on the derelicts, it starts at 7%, and that increases by 50% annually.
Okay. And how then would you deal with the issue of the number of vacant homes that aren't being sat on by people for speculation, but it might be someone tied up in the Fair Deal scheme, or somebody's in state care, or that kind of scenario, which is a lot of them, to be fair, especially in the kind of cities. So how do you tackle that then?
Yeah, so obviously, look, if a property is in probate, if a property is in Fair Deal, for example, then we shouldn't be going after it with the tax. They're not the properties we're after. And to be honest, if you look at the average length of time somebody spends in Fair Deal nursing home care, unfortunately, it's actually a relatively short period of time, and those properties will then eventually find their way either into active use or into kind of owner occupation. So the ones we really need to go after are either the ones that are being speculatively sat on, or the ones where people just couldn't bother, where they inherit a home and it's just somewhere, and they've no interest in doing anything with it, and for no good reason it's lying vacant.
Yeah.
Likewise with derelicts. I mean, there's a lot of derelicts out there where nobody even knows who they own. And those are the ones we have to go after. So people need to be very clear. Properties in probate, if there's a legal dispute between family members, if it's in Fair Deal, that's not the properties we're after. It is all the rest. But also it's a lot of the overshot vacancy and dereliction. And again, if you make it much, much easier for private individuals or local authorities to convert those, and at the same time you have a really punitive vacant and derelict property tax implemented ruthlessly by revenue, those two things combined should start to see a significant number of properties brought back into use annually.
And
it's 106 of the plan is where the taxation element of our vacancy and dereliction is. There's a whole section of the plan from page 103 on, dealing with the private sector side, but then in the public sector side, earlier on in the housing plan, we set out what we do with the local authorities. I mean, for example, if you're a local authority housing manager, let's say in Galway, and you want to acquire a block in the historic centre of Galway and turn it into a really vibrant mixed income, social affordable rental and affordable purchase residential development, really good for the environment because of its location, it's mentally really good for the city. Virtually impossible to do that. The way in which public funding for local authorities is set up means it is prohibitive, if not absolutely impossible to do that. Again, we've set out very clearly how we fix those problems, giving in advance funding for purchasing and for the refurbishment of the property to ensure those homes go back into use. Why? Not only is it better from a urban development point of view, but the lowest carbon home is the building that already exists. And if we're going to meet those targets, we don't just have to use far more low carbon building technologies, we have to use far greater numbers of existing residential and commercial structures for social, affordable and private homes. And therefore we have to make it the immediate and default option, particularly for our local authority.
The price tag then of your plan is 39 billion, I think, which is obviously a big commitment. So let's talk money. Can you give a breakdown of where the money is going to come from, especially if things change and it makes borrowing more expensive?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, the first thing is Sinn Féin has said very clearly, housing, and particularly affordable housing, is the number one priority. And therefore, in our manifesto that we'll launch in advance of the election in the alternative budget we launched a couple of weeks ago, and in the housing plan we launched, you can see very clearly we're essentially doubling capital investment in social and affordable housing over those 5 years. Obviously, where that funding comes from is a mixture of increasing direct exchequer funding that's given in the budgets each year. But then there's a significant amount of funding for public housing that already comes from low interest borrowing, the Housing Finance Agency, the European Investment Bank, and a couple of other sources. So we set it out on page 57 of the housing plan, where the kind of annual expenditure, index linked for inflation, on social and affordable housing is about 7.8 billion euros. And that's just for housing delivery. You'll often hear the minister quoting figures of 4 or 5 billion euros of capital investment each year. A significant amount of that isn't for new home delivery. It's for retrofitting, which is very important. It's for defects. That's very important. We have funding allocated for those separately. So when I use these figures, this is just capital investment for new homes. So it's about 5.1 billion would be from the exchequer, like 2.7 billion would be from those borrowing sources. Those borrowing sources will remain low, even if the interest rate climate changes. We know that over the last number of years, because they're government guaranteed HFA and EIB loans. One of the tragedies is if governments had embraced our approach 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the cost of capital to the state was even lower, we'd have got much greater efficiency. The cost of capital to the state is still very, very reasonable. We still have some exchequer surpluses. That's not going to last forever. That money has to be invested in critical infrastructure deficits now. Housing is the number one priority, but also transport and renewable energy are the other two that we talk about in our alternative budget and our manifesto. And that's where the sources of funding will come from. Obviously, there are some other capital requirements that are required with a lot of money to spend on dealing with the Celtic Tiger defects, whether defective block or building defects. Thankfully, we can reserve a significant portion of the Apple tax and AIB share sale to do that kind of work. But the two major sources for that 7.8 billion annually is both the exchequer expenditure, the budget each year, and borrowings from HFA, EIB, and a couple of other sources that are currently nice and low interest rate for the HB sector.
And how would you then ensure that that amount of spending doesn't result in cutbacks in other areas, so like health or education?
Yeah, so again, in our alternative budgets, but also then in our manifesto, we'll set that out very clearly. There's a window of opportunity available right now for increased capital investment in those critical infrastructure deficits. So we have to do that now while the money is available. There's a separate issue, obviously, which is the ongoing current expenditure, and Pierce Doherty and the finance team will set that out in the 5-year manifesto. But given the fiscal position that we're currently in, we are absolutely convinced, and again, we factored in inflation for the capital programme over 5 years, that we can run this level of capital investment without running into a deficit in any year over those 5 years and retain current expenditure at the level that's required. And you'll have seen David Cullinan recently published his 5-year health reform programme, which is going to require increases in current expenditure, particularly in terms of frontline medical staff. But Pierce Doherty and our finance team are both absolutely confident, and with the manifesto we'll publish in great detail how we believe both the current and capital expenditure that we're proposing is not only available, but would allow us to operate without running into a deficit in any of the 5 years from next year.
And if that capital requirement is there for some, like what happens then if the money just isn't there? What is there a plan B?
So the first thing is the money is there, and look, you can hypothesize that what happens if the world changes tomorrow, but we have pretty good visibility on where things are at over the next number of years, and the capital is there. Obviously, if circumstances change, you have to reassess that. But right now, between the reserves, between the surpluses, and between the availability of low capital cost finance for the state and state agencies, the money is available today to make these critical investments. The real issue is if we don't spend that money now, we're going to be in a much worse position a number of years down the line we're already hearing the growing chorus from industry, both SDI and SME Indigenous sector, that the high cost of housing or the lack of affordable housing is really impacting on our competitiveness and business and industry stability. If you talk about public sector providers and the unions in those public sectors, you know this from your own profession. Again, it's becoming increasingly difficult to employ public sector workers at the lower entry-level grade in Dublin and the commuter belt in the city. So there is an economic and social cost to not making this investment now. That cost is going to grow the longer it's left. It should have been done some years ago. But we're absolutely confident all the information we have is this can be done and can be done now. It would be different if you were spending all of this money on current expenditure and on recurrent expenditure. These are capital investments. These are investments in the social and economic infrastructure and critical infrastructure of the state. The money is there and now is the time to do it.
Okay. I guess I've had you for quite a while now, but if you were to say maybe let's imagine Sinn Féin are in government, whether you're likely to be in as a coalition with somebody else. I'm not interested in politics and who's going in with who or any of that. But imagine you're in. What would be your first 3 actions then that you would take as a party to start implementing this plan? And how soon will people then start to see results, do you think?
So 3 is an arbitrary number, and there would be more immediate actions. But if you go back to the very start of the conversation, the only way we can ramp up the delivery of public and private homes is radically reforming the way in which those homes are delivered. So a very significant part of our plan is about doing that and doing that quickly. One of the great recommendations of the Housing Commission was the establishment of a housing supply oversight executive to help ramp up the delivery of those homes and align the capital investment programs, not just to public and private sector residential developers, the Nisca Éireann, the utility networks and public sector service providers like education and transport. That would be a really key action to get up and running immediately. Reforming the approval and procurement system for the delivery of public housing, absolutely key. And shifting those activation supports for the private residential development sector, particularly in terms of resourcing planning and getting access to lower cost finance and site servicing early on. They're really important actions immediately. But what we'd also do, of course, is, because we haven't had a chance to talk about homelessness, we need to see the number of adults and children in emergency accommodation start to reduce quarterly and year on year. And again, we've quite a detailed section on how we would achieve that and end long-term homelessness by 2030. But within 3 to 6 months, publish that ending homeless action plan with the public and private sector, or the public and voluntary sector providers, with clear targets quarterly and annually. We would, within the first 12 months, hold a referendum to give people the opportunity to enshrine the right to secure adequate and affordable housing into the Constitution, a very important tool in the overall policy box. But in some senses, and again, the Housing Commission report speaks to this, as does our plan, there's no 1 or 2 or 3 actions. You have to come at this in a very holistic way. You need to make very profound policy changes from day one. That's why the Housing Commission rightly called for that kind of radical reset. And then year on year, people would start to see improvement, both in terms of the number of affordable homes to purchase, a price of 250 and above, the number of private homes to purchase, currently stagnating, as you know, about 8,000 a year. That have to rise. The number of people getting out of private rental and into social housing, and the number of people in emergency accommodation reducing each year. I think you would be able to see tangible progress by the end of year 1, 2, and 3. But of course, nobody is suggesting that by year 5, we're going to be living in a housing utopia where everybody's housing needs are met. But I'm absolutely of the view that if you implement the right policy in the right way, with the right targets and funding, people will start to see tangible material impacts both for themselves and across the state year on year from the end of the first full 12 months of government.
And you read my mind, because my last question was going to be on homelessness, because it's obviously something that's at the front of most people's minds, especially myself, because I'm seeing it, obviously online, but I'm also seeing it in my day-to-day job. And your plans then to tackle that. And I know you can take into account, look, if you're increasing social housing, if you're increasing affordable housing and all that, it should take a little bit of the stress out of, say, HAP and all the rest, and then that would free up homes then for other people to rent, which would, have that trickle down effect. But what would be the first thing you would do on homelessness if you were, let's say you were elected tomorrow?
So again, we have a very clear package of proposals that wouldn't hopefully lead to a reduction in homelessness, but would lead to a reduction in homelessness. The first thing is we'd reintroduce on a 6-month basis the ban on evictions where tenants have done nothing wrong to stop the flow of people into emergency accommodation. We would provide funding for 6,500 tenant in situs, giving local authorities visibility in AHBs, visibility on what they can acquire over that's 5 years of government. We would double the availability of housing first tenancies. That's for single people with specific needs and emergency accommodation. But we also double the total number of new social home allocations for people in emergency accommodation. So first of all, you'd stop the flow in. You'd have that series of emergency measures to get people out. We've also a very innovative proposal around delivering a stream of age-friendly infill housing using new building technology, about 10,000 units over 5 years. The first year you'd end homelessness for the over 55 straight away. The rest of those units then you'd use to voluntarily right-size people within existing communities, and the homes they would free up for both families with children in emergency accommodation. So all of that would stop the flow in on a short-term basis and dramatically accelerate the exits from homelessness. And while that's happening, you'd be ramping up the delivery of social homes, and that would then mean there would be far less pressure on the system. Finland had shown, up until when the government changed over the last year, Finland has shown it is possible, where government makes it a priority, to effectively end long-term homelessness. Of course, some people will always continue to lose their homes. Some people will end up in emergency accommodation for short periods of time. But the idea that since 2011, when Fine Gael's first got into government, we had about 3,000 people in emergency accommodation, including about 600 children. And today we have 14,000, almost 15,000 people in emergency accommodation, 4,500 of those are children. And that's not even including the number of women and children in truce to domestic violence refuges or folks in other emergency accommodation settings. We have never been wealthier. We have never had more access to skill and talent. We have never had so much vacancy and dereliction. The only reason why month on month the number of adults and children are going into emergency accommodation is because it's not a priority for government. And for me, the really frustrating thing is the actual number of households who are in emergency accommodation is still relatively small compared to the overall size of our population. So ending long-term homelessness by 2030 is eminently achievable, but only if you take the right kind of decisive action and you make it a priority. No pensioner, no child, no person with a disability should be spending year upon year upon year in emergency accommodation. This is one that you can solve in 5 years, and within year one you can demonstrate clear progress, but only if the right policies are implemented, and we believe we've set those out very clearly in the plan. Not policies we've invented, policies we've listened to and learned from homeless service providers and from international best practice, including in countries where they've cracked this particular problem, Finland being the most obvious one, certainly up until the change of government recently.
And I think that's probably a good place to leave it on that one. So thank you so much, Deputy Ó Broin, for coming on and talking us through your plan.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, Kieran.
Agus sin é le haghaidh an episode seo of the Crazy House Prices podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope it's given you a better understanding of the plan and how it would work if Sinn Féin were in government. As I said, this is not a political podcast. I have no idea if there was a general election tomorrow who I would vote for. I have no idea if the plan would work if in government, but it's interesting to talk in a bit more detail with people who have written these plans. So I think it's a good way of kind of breaking down the information and just trying to get it into your ears. So don't forget, if you're interested in more podcasts, you can check out all the other episodes I have here. I think we're on around episode 27 at the moment. I also have well over 100 podcasts, short kind of 10-15 minute ones over on my Patreon. So please do share this episode with anyone you think might be interested. And if you're enjoying it, and if you enjoy my Instagram and want to show your support, head over to that patreon.com/Crazy House Prices. Your support then not only keeps this podcast and the Instagram page going, but it gives you, as I said, exclusive access to bonus content like the detailed Q&As and lots of other stuff. Plus you also get access to engage with me and my community of over 106,000 followers now, and you can ask me a question, and if I don't know, I can put it to my followers, and it just gives you answers that just Google would not be able to do for you. Also, my book How to Buy a Home in Ireland is available nationwide. Just Google it, you'll find it in stock somewhere, or you can rent it from your local library for free. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll chat to you all soon. Slán go fóill.